there, how's it going? My name is Ryan, your unexceptional craftsman for this build. In this video, you're going to see me create a game room sign based off of the in-game drop zone map from Helldivers 2. A wide variety of tools and materials were utilized, some of which were first-time use for me, so needless to say, there's some unexceptional craftsmanship in this build. Unfortunately, my camera also corrupted some of the build process footage, but hopefully you'll be able to enjoy this slightly abbreviated version. As you can see in the video, one of the main workhorses for this build was an 80-watt CO2 laser, and I could not have done this sign without it. I did all the design work off camera in a program called Lightburn, and I'm just going to flash the image here to show you kind of what that looks like. It can sometimes be a bit of an in-depth process, but essentially what I did was pull the in-game image of the dive map into Lightburn, and then I traced over it using the various available tools. For the Helldivers 2 logo, I imported that into Inkscape first. Then I converted it to an SVG so I could import it into Lightburn and scale it up or down without distorting the image. Once all your design files are finalized in Lightburn, you basically just set up your materials inside the laser, press play, and watch it go. What the laser has been and currently is doing is engraving the various layout lines and cutting out the various land features that are going to be used to create elevation and give depth to the map. I'm showing the laser engrave and cut in real time just to give you an idea of how long some of this laser work can take. All in all, I probably have just over a couple of hours of laser work in this project. With the map base cut out, it was time to align it with the engraving lines from earlier and glue it down to the overall base. The glue ended up struggling coming out of the glue bot. I think it was expired, but overall it was not a major issue. It still ended up securing the pieces together. I failed to mention earlier, but I'm using a 1/4 inch birch plywood from my local big box store, and I used that for all the map base and topographical features. While I'm only showing a few clamps here, I ended up using about 5 or 6 just to make sure that the map base was securely glued down. With the map base glued down, it was time to glue down the individual topographical land features to help create that depth for the overall project. I ended up switching over to a tacky super glue because the drying time was faster, it was much easier to use, and it wasn't expired like the wood glue I was using earlier. It's hard to gauge the elevation for the hills and valleys based off of the in-game image alone, so I gave it my best guess, and I think I got it close enough. Now we're back at the laser to cut out the inlays for the water features out of a blue cast acrylic. This has masking on both sides to prevent smoke residue from fouling up the final pieces. Because the acrylic that I used was semi-transparent, the natural color of the plywood ended up showing through more than I had expected it to. So I ended up going off camera and painting the base layer blue to help get that color that I was looking for. As you might have noticed earlier, it took me several tries to get the fit right for these acrylic water pieces, but once I did, they had a nice friction fit. Add the laser cutter once again to cut out the blue and black lines that surround the map and the image. There are a lot of these, so enjoy the rapid fire laser cutting. These lines are made from blue and black non-transparent cast acrylic, which really worked out for the application. Here I'm taking those black and blue acrylic lines and lining them up with the layout lines that I had engraved earlier on the base. Unfortunately, this is an area where my camera ended up corrupting a lot of the footage, so I don't have a lot to show, but that's okay because I ended up misaligning quite a few of the pieces. To give the map some actual texture, I ended up using this creative paper clay. It's a material that I've never used before, and I actually ended up liking it. It's very lightweight and goes on pretty easily, dries fast, it's air dried, so it worked out very well. Now I'm just cutting Q-tips to create the trunks of the trees. Off camera, I ended up drilling holes for the trees, and as you can see, I started putting the trunks in, which was pointless because, again, lack of planning. Ended up pulling all of these out anyways to paint them and put tree tops on them individually. So, yeah. This, unfortunately, is the only footage I have of painting the map itself. But here I'm just trying to paint the shoreline to give that a darker color and then go back in with lighter colors for the rest of the map. This was my first method for painting the tree trunks, which worked out okay, but it ended up being better just taking the complete tree and painting the trunk and treetop together. Just a quick glimpse of all the trees I made. Here I'm using a thickness planer on the wood for the two frames that will ultimately become the galactic war table that holds the map. I cut out a lot of footage here, but just know there was a lot of planing. Here I'm using my homemade circle jig for my router, which ended up being a failure because the screw and washer that I used was not tightened down all the way and caused the router to vary off course, which ended up making one of my rings smaller than the other and created an offset that I wasn't quite looking for. But hey, I ended up adapting and I think I was able to get it to work out fine in the end. Due to my poorly designed router jig, I ended up switching to the jigsaw to do the remaining cutting for the frame. As you will see here soon, my frame broke, and I wish I could say this was the only time, but each frame actually ended up breaking about 2 to 3 times in the process. Thankfully though, I was able to get them glued back together and everything functioned fine. Here I'm using a flush trim router bit to cut the remaining depth that was made wavy after using the jigsaw. The guide on the bit actually rolls on the side that was cut with the router earlier, so that part's already smooth, and then the flush trim router bit is used to just clean up the remaining jigsaw cuts. Now I'm routing an offset for the base of the map to sit in. I also end up doing this for the top frame so that the acrylic with the Helldivers 2 logo can sit down into that piece as well. Here we have lots of sanding, which I didn't film too much of because it is just boring, old, monotonous sanding. I used various different grits of sandpaper to get that nice smooth finish, but it's just the basic principle of sand, sand, sand. Now I'm rounding a chamfer on the top frame, which I ended up doing on both sides of the frame to just give it a nice edge profile. And again, more sanding. This is just me showing the final sanded frames and kind of what they look like and how they're going to go together. Here I'm applying the Minwax Wood Finish Solid Color Stain in True Black. This is a premium water-based stain that goes on a little thicker to hide more of the grain, but not completely hide it, which is what I was looking for. I ended up using it on both frames as well as the inside securing ring. I am not sponsored by Minwax in any way, shape, or form, but this is a product I've used on other projects before, and I like the final look that it gives. This is a plug-in LED strip that I've had for years. It comes with an adhesive backing and is one that you can cut to size to fit your project. Off camera, I also routed channels in both frames so the wiring could run through. This here is rubber tubing that I use for a replacement fuel line for my auger, which ended up working quite well for my needs for this build. I used it to make a ring for the top acrylic piece to sit down on at a height that allowed the LED to edge light that acrylic while also shining through to still illuminate the rest of the map. I had originally used a black auto and marine rubber weather seal to support the acrylic, but it blocked too much of the LED light and didn't illuminate the map, so I happened to remember that I had some of this rubber fuel line on hand and it worked out perfectly. Here I am placing the map into the offset that was cut earlier in the frame. Unfortunately, I do not have the footage for painting the actual map itself, but you're not missing much. I'm not a painter, and this ended up being just a mess for me. I actually had to ask my wife to help me out because I was struggling. So many thanks to her for helping me get this portion of the build straightened out, because man, was it a headache for me. As you see here, I'm lining up the channels for the LED power cord to run through so that the cord runs through the back of the piece. I'm also pressing down this internal ring to friction fit the map base to the bottom frame. Here is another ring that I cut with the laser off camera. I'm drilling holes in it for magnets because this is going to be a magnetic piece that you can pull on and off to be able to access and remove the acrylic top piece. As you can see, I also drilled corresponding holes on the top frame as well for additional magnets. I chose to paint this magnetic ring the iconic Helldivers yellow because, Super Earth demands it. And it really just draws that attention to it and fully makes that connection to the series. There are easily over 100 trees that I had to make, paint, drill holes for, then put said trees in those holes to determine if there was enough spacing between the trees to see if I had to remake some of the treetops or move the trees around to different locations to help actually ensure that they could fit on the map. Which, if you've been keeping up with the common theme of this build, I ended up having to do, as you'll see later. Back to the laser to engrave and cut out some icons from the game. Here I'm making the icons to represent my character in game, as well as my fellow unexceptional craftsman Adam, and the extraction point. As you can see, I laser cut 3 clear acrylic stems to help create that floating effect for the icons. Given I haven't worked with acrylic before, I was a little surprised at just how well super glue ended up working. That's actually part of the reason I had issues in the beginning with those acrylic black and blue lines, because once I put that glue on, they stuck and did not come back up. As I'm sure you'll notice while I place these icons down on the map, the trees are a different shade of blue, and that's because they were repainted along with everything else. Again. Now I'm applying some tung oil to the outside of the frame just to give it a little extra shine and protection. 2 coats I believe are recommended. I only ended up doing 1 because the shine from 1 was fine enough for me. This engraving was by far the most exciting engraving of the build. Just the size of the logo and how clean the lines came out. It ended up looking great, and I couldn't be happier with it. So here I'm just loosely fitting everything together just to test the lighting out and make sure that it's working as intended. Overall, I really enjoyed this build. Even with the mistakes, I think it did a pretty good job of bringing that in-game image to life. I hope this shows that despite being an unexceptional craftsman like me, you still can make some really cool things.